Good morning. Hope that was enough of a break. I think I'm a little intimidated by going on the slot that's just before lunch. As a teacher, that's usually when the natives turn restless. So Mr. Gilbert and I will be talking about why we do a great books education today. And I'm very certain that we're going to have some questions at the end, so we'll make sure to leave some time for any questions that you have. I do have a handout for you. So Mr. Gilbert, would you? It's just two long quotations that we're going to look at together at a certain point. By the way, my name is John Mueller. I'm Dean of the Lower School here at the Saint Constantine School. I teach primarily in the middle and upper school, but I've taught anywhere between 3rd and 12th, depending on the need here. And I think we need one more over here. So it should come as no surprise to you that I am decidedly in favor of our methods of instruction here at the Saint Constantine School. I consider myself fortunate to have had a hand in their design and implementation. I will, however, admit that it must be especially strange to attend middle school here. In 3rd through 5th grade, a student here will be required to read somewhere between 4 and 10 books per year, depending on the grade level, over the course of the entire year. These books are classics in their respective genre, but are generally age-specific and pretty much what you would expect to find in a good children's bookstore section. Aesop's Fables, Greek and Roman myths, tales of Arthur and his knights, Charlotte's Web, just to name a few. And this is as it should be. Something odd, though, happens in 6th grade here. The pace of reading increases to a new book every 1 to 2 weeks. Usually every week, actually. And the authors with strange names begin to appear. To be sure, familiar names are still present, like C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien, Madeleine L'Engle or Kenneth Graham. But alongside them are some very serious-seeming strangers. Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Athanasius, Shakespeare, Milton, Donne, Longfellow. Our students begin an Introduction to Great Books series in 6th grade, which is a 3-year sequence that we have designed in hopes of preparing them for an even bigger challenge, the high school Great Books classes. This 4-year sequence has a reading list that rivals many of the most rigorous honors colleges in the nation and covers 3,000 years of the greatest poetry, philosophy, history, and literature in the Western canon. But why are we doing this? Have we forgotten that these are middle and high school students, not baccalaureate or graduate scholars? Are we being unfair in our expectations? Are we, as one student so eloquently put it a few years back, just a bunch of nerds who would have assigned these books so that we could read them? It's not a fair accusation. We are nerds, but that's not why we're and what's so great about the great books anyway? I believe we have great answers to these questions, and it is my hope that Mr. Gilbert and I can offer you a compelling vision of the program that drives our middle and upper school. This is a great books education for every student, regardless of background, regardless of career aspirations, and perhaps most importantly, no matter how smart a standardized test would indicate he or she might be. An education that leads to flourishing must approach the whole student, an embodied and ensouled image of God who spoke all creation into being, against modern practices that might treat a student as a tabula rasa or a blank slate to be filled with whatever impressions the experts choose. A classical education presupposes a rational soul with the capacity and energy to engage with great ideas. Plutarch argued in his Moralia that students, even young ones, are far more capable of this than we often think, such that a teacher more often needs to be a guide, or the word that Socrates uses is a midwife, than an instructor. Plutarch says, "Let us urge them," the students, "when their intelligence has comprehended the main points, that they put the rest together by their own efforts, and use their memory as a guide in thinking for themselves, and taking discourse as another germ and seed, develop and expand it. For the mind does not require filling like a vessel, but rather like wood, requires only kindling to create an impulse to think independently and have an ardent desire for truth." Rather than thinking of education like filling an empty receptacle, Plutarch argues that it should be seen as lighting a fire. And the way that the best teachers have been lighting fires for thousands of years is to put great books in front of their students. I'm going to appeal to two great authors who provide two different ways of thinking about the role of great books in education. The first will be romantic, not in the sense of appealing to eros, but in the sense of appealing to our ideals. And that will be from Longfellow. And the second will be entirely, I would say, pragmatic. And that one will be from our old friend C.S. Lewis. These views are by no means mutually exclusive. And in the end, I would say that they are harmonious, though they do represent two modes of approaching the great books. And this is on what should be the first side of your handout. In any case, it's on one side of your handout. This would be from The Lives of Literary Men, which is a lecture that Longfellow delivered. It sounds like it's intended just for scholars because it says The Lives of Literary Men. I would argue that what Longfellow means here is that this is about people who read good books, great books. So let's listen to what he has to say. Different characters of books. Some instruct us, others educate us. Differences between instruction and education in themselves and in their effects. Learning is the result of instruction, wisdom the result of education. There are learned men who are not wise, and wise men who are not learned, and so have books. Some make us learned, others wise. Some fill the mind with instruction, others develop its powers and resources, and it is filled with wisdom. Instruction is the material. Wisdom is the result of the mind's operation in that material. Again, you may fill a man's body with food, and yet not nourish him. So you may fill his mind with instruction, and yet not educate him. Instruction, then, is the food of the mind. Wisdom is food changed by the operation of the mind, assimilated to its own nature, and made part of the mind itself. This is the difference between instruction and education, between a learned man and an educated man. We may, however, reduce these principles of criticism to two. The author's intention in writing the book. In other words, the class of works to which it belongs. The book is good or bad as a work of art. It is absurd to find fault with a song because it is not a sermon, or a ballad because it is not an epic poem. The question is, has the author done in a masterly style what he intended to do? But there is a higher standard than this. A book may be an exquisite work of art, and yet in every other point of view, execrable. The sculptured vases from Pompeii, the brazen lamps, the relief in marble, looked upon merely as works of art, are surpassingly beautiful. Yet in themselves, in the scenes they represent, how disgusting, how offensive to the principles of moral delicacy within us. This higher standard, then, is the moral principle of our own nature as established by Christianity. Christianity is either nothing to us, or it is everything. Therefore, I say, even in literary criticism, grieve not the spirit. Whatever offends the moral principle is wrong, is bad. It cannot educate us aright. The books, then, that educate us, I prize more highly than those which merely instruct. Books which excite and develop our minds, which call forth energies from us, of whose existence we hardly dream, which open us to new realms of thought and whisper to our souls, ye too are denizens of these fair lands. Such books are to be our bosom friends. Full disclosure, if you want to hear a much more full and cohesive exploration of this passage, I would commend to you a recent lecture by Dr. Timothy Bartell, who is our resident Longfellow expert. But a couple things that I want to draw your attention to here. The distinction that Longfellow makes between instruction and education is a profound one. And there is the undeniable and key role of the great books in this, right? Because the great books represent the greatest minds in the Western tradition or the Eastern tradition. And Longfellow doesn't insist that we believe everything that they tell us. And this is a very important thing that Mr. Gilbert's going to touch on later with reference to embracing the challenge of ideas and not being afraid of ideas. We don't agree with everything we read in the great books canon. That is actually impossible to do because the authors are frequently disagreeing with one another. But Longfellow says we don't critique a song because it is not a sermon. It would be absurd to do that. I remember growing up, there was a man in our church who, he would ask me what music I was listening to. And I would tell him, whatever it is I told him when I was 12 or 13 or 14. I like to think I had good taste then, but it's probably not true. And he would say, I'll bet the theology's pretty weak on those guys. Right? It was something that deeply galled me. Not just because he was critiquing something that I liked, but because some part of me knew that it was actually an inappropriate accusation to level at these musical artists, right? We don't expect a sermon in a song. Now, some songs can greatly aid a sermon, but it's not the primary function, right? Longfellow says, is it a masterly work of art for what the author has set out to achieve? That much is true of everything in our great books canon. Even the authors who some of us really personally despise, or at least whose ideas we strongly reject. Is Nietzsche a master in what he set out to do? Absolutely. Do I agree with him? No, not a bit. About most things. I'll make a bold assertion. And if anyone disagrees, I welcome dialogue about it at a later time. Modern schooling is almost entirely concerned with what Longfellow would call instruction, and almost not at all with what Longfellow would call education, right? This calling forth of energies of whose existence we hardly dream, what Plutarch calls igniting the mind, awakening our own desire for truth, believing that that capacity is there in each human and is not just meant to be dumped onto you by the local expert of a given topic. Again, these are books that excite, that develop our minds. And they are our bosom friends. So Longfellow gives kind of the romantic, right? We read so that we do not feel alone, that kind of idea. Let's switch over to Lewis, who, if you're not at all compelled by Longfellow's sort of lofty words about the great books and what they can do for your soul, let's listen to what Lewis has to say. Every age has its own outlook. It is especially good at seeing certain truths and especially liable to make certain mistakes. We all, therefore, need the books that will correct the characteristic mistakes of our own period, and that means the old books. All contemporary writers share to some extent the same contemporary outlook, even those like myself who seem most opposed to it. Nothing strikes me more when I read the controversies of past ages than the fact that both sides were usually assuming, without question, a good deal which we should now absolutely deny. They thought that they were as completely opposed as two sides could be. But in fact, all the time, they were secretly united with each other and against earlier and later ages by a great mass of common assumptions. We may be sure that the characteristic blindness of the 20th century, the blindness about which posterity will ask, but how could they have thought that, lies where we have never suspected it. And it concerns something about which there is untroubled agreement between Hitler and President Roosevelt, or between Mr. H.G. Wells and Karl Barth. None of us can fully escape this blindness, but we shall certainly increase it, or weaken our guard against it if we read only modern books. Where they are true, they will give us truths that we half knew already. And where they are false, they will aggravate the error with which we are already dangerously ill. The only palliative is to keep the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds, and this can be done only by reading old books. Not, of course, that there is any magic about the past. People were no cleverer then than they are now. They made as many mistakes as we, but not the same mistakes. They will not flatter us in the errors we are already committing, and their own errors, being now so open and palpable, will not endanger us. Two heads are better than one, not because either is infallible, but because they are unlikely to go wrong in the same direction. To be sure, books of the future would be just as good a corrective as the books of the past, but unfortunately, we cannot get at them. I don't know if Lewis actually believed that, given how worried he was about the future, but I think he couldn't resist being that clever. But he is right. If he's appealing only to this pragmatic assertion, right? And if you know Lewis's specialization, he wasn't an apologist or a Christian fiction writer by profession. He was a medieval and Renaissance scholar of the very highest order at Oxford University and Cambridge later. So for him to say, yeah, there's no magic about the past, it really means something, because if you could accuse anyone of just being obsessed with the past, you would think it would be someone who has their doctoral degree and their profession in the past. And he says, no. The main point here is to keep the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds, to keep us free of our own errors. And without contradicting Longfellow's ideal vision of the education that great books offers us, Lewis hones in on the strictly pragmatic role that great books from the past can play in strengthening our critical acumen, and most importantly, their capacity to disabuse us of our own blindness, our chronological snobbery, our inability to inhabit any frame of mind other than the one that we simply have because we were born in a specific time and place. Simply by receiving the presuppositions of our time, we are, according to Lewis, dangerously ill. At this school, we seek not to idolize authors or texts from the past, but to keep the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our halls, that the very air will be infectious to our students and give them energy to take hold of their own education, for only then can they experience liberation. Gilbert?
Yeah. Stop me if you've heard this before. When I first started teaching high school great books, 6 years ago here in Houston, I had to lead a class on Homer's The Iliad. The class was under the rubric English, E-N-G-L. And my degrees are in philosophy. My teaching experience at the time had only been philosophy courses and a couple of religion courses. And I was nervous. Even though it was a great books class, even though I had done the preparation and knew the book, I was nervous. I don't have an English degree or an English master's, I thought. So I'm sure I'm going to miss something. And they're all going to know. I remember driving to the class on the way other side of Houston with my then boss, now wife, and boss. And I said to her, so will I have to talk about foreshadowing or flashbacks or something? Do I need to talk about Englishy stuff? And she said, David, a novel or a poem or a work of history asks the same thing that a philosophy book does. You just have to find the question in the book. Of course. I was mildly embarrassed because it was like somebody reminding me of my own name. It was something I already knew. This is how I read books already, or poetry or novels. This is how my friends and I talked about them. This is how people can love discussing and writing stories but hate English class. And there I was getting all nervous because of an abbreviation. There is a tendency to over-specialize. And truly, in some sense, specialization is required and good. Truly, truly. The mastery of anything requires a focused attention to the demands of that thing. And those demands mean familiarization of sometimes technical skills, language, and literature. But specialization becomes a problem when disciplines isolate from one another and do not talk. When that isolation creates in individuals an inability to draw connections on the one hand, or recognize where one's beliefs are in conflict on the other. Or finally, when we're so specialized that we grow in one area of our lives and do not grow in all the other areas of our lives. The Saint Constantine School president, Dr. Reynolds, likes to give the example of a doctor who has the technical skills and language suited to his expertise, but in speaking about politics, has the vocabulary of memes. Or in speaking about romantic relationships, has the vocabulary of hot or not. This isn't a crazy fabrication. You very well may know people who are similar to this. In the case of the doctor, there has been exceeding specialization in one area of his life, and probably an extreme malnourishment in the humanities. If only, you might say, he had read carefully Plato and Aristotle, Hobbes, Locke, and the Founding Fathers before he specialized, he wouldn't be at the mercy of memes when discussing politics. If only, you might say, he had thought through the works of Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, and Shakespeare before he was ready to reduce love to monosyllables. There's an important way that even junior hires are ready to start this work through the humanities. In this developmentally charged time of life, which I would never want to repeat, an 11 or 12-year-old's minds and interests change. I think it was over a weekend that my twin brother and I stopped playing with action figures. We noticed it at the time. Now I'm kind of sad about it. They were awesome. We didn't keep them. I don't know what happened to them. But at the time, we were liberated. It felt liberating not to play with toys anymore. And that's not all. We suddenly wanted to engage intellectually with our friends and with our parents. Our parents enrolled us in a debate and speech club after school. We started valuing those times when we got to stay up late and talk about more grown-up things with mom and dad. And it felt important to be included in the world's affairs. To some extent, we were ready. Our minds and our interests changed. We wanted the challenge. This isn't limited in my experience. My brother and I were pretty ordinary, very awkward preteens. And I'm sure you've noticed the change in your kids. Sometimes I wonder if with that intellectual change in junior high, we actually could have done more. Certainly nothing like like Saint Constantine School's Great Books program was available to us in our neck of East Texas in the early to mid 1990s. But I often wonder, what if I had the opportunity to do that at that age? Often we expect too little of certain age groups, and so dumb down education for that age group. I think this happens at all levels of education. So you might hear, for instance, that certain jobs require someone to have a master's, where those same jobs with the same expectations used to require only a bachelor's degree. Something like this might suggest that it isn't the job that has changed, it's the standards of education that have changed. And so the hypothesis would be graduate school becomes the new bachelor's degree, and a bachelor's degree becomes the new high school diploma, and things we should have learned in junior high are carried on into high school, and junior high is continued grade school. But developmentally, in each of these stages, the student would still be ready for more, right? If school is dumbed down and each age group receives the protracted education well into later intellectual stages, won't the student find intellectual stimulation elsewhere? My guess is that the answer here would be yes. And that probably, though this talk has nothing to do with social media trends or the lack of academic credibility on most content on the internet, probably the intellectual stimulation will come online in buzzy and blustery commentary, divorced from the history of ideas and letters, or in integrated education. And that seems like a waste of school to me. Suppose junior hires are ready to begin reading well, thinking well, discussing well, and arguing well. They're not going to do it well, but they're going to begin to do it well. That's what we suppose at the Saint Constantine School, and that's what happens. Yesterday, I overheard a 9th grade student who was with us last year in the 8th grade say that she doesn't love reading Plato, but she loves discussing Plato. She said it to a friend in class, and I don't think she thought I heard her. I am in entire solidarity with this student about reading Plato. He can be really tough. He's very tough for me. But that challenge doesn't defeat the value of reading Plato. Notice, she couldn't have said that if she hadn't put in the effort, unlovely as it was for her, to actually read Plato. If, for instance, Mr. Mueller had summarized Plato for her, or handed her a single page of dialogue, she wouldn't have earned the discussion, where she got to reason together with her peers the immortality of the soul, or try really hard, again with her peers, to sparse out the difference between those things that exist everywhere and always, and just sort of are, like numbers and goodness and God. Those big things. Think of those things. From those other things that come to be and fade away, like tables and chairs and bananas. We have a lot of bananas in our house with our kids. But they go brown really fast and they don't last very long. And people, maybe people, are they the type of things that come to be and fade away? Maybe their bodies but not their souls are the type of things that come to be and fade away. And maybe how these things that come to be and fade away never sort of never really are in the same way that numbers and goodness and God are. Or as Plato puts it, that which is and never comes to be versus that which comes to be but never is. Not only that, but maybe these other things that really are, like numbers and goodness and God, maybe they're also related somehow. And maybe because they never come to be but always are, they're the things that we should really be focusing our attention on and thinking about. That discussion is important. And it's earned by reading. Because you can come to class commiserating with your friends on how long-winded and dreary the Plato reading is. And say to Mr. Mueller, Mr. Mueller, why do I have to read Plato? I didn't understand a thing in there. And he says, which part? And probably the response is, I don't know all of it. And they'll say, can you think of a specific part that was hard? And they'll say, okay, how about where he starts saying, the being is or comes to be or something. And he'll say, read it. And they find it together and she reads that which is and never comes to be. And Mr. Mueller asks what Plato is talking about, or what he means by that big phrase. And the discussion is off, and it's earned, and it's lasting. So offhandedly to her friends, a year later, yesterday, says, "I don't love reading Plato, but I love discussing him." It's experiences like this that convince me that this kind of education is not just for the brilliant, the future PhDs in philosophies, or the future kings of Bavaria. I was trying to think of a place that I don't know. It's for everyone. People who know me, but don't quite understand what I do, often think that it's just for the future kings of Bavaria. They think I've got a class full of wizard super geniuses whose genius comes to them by birth. I don't. I've never had a class full of super geniuses, wizard super geniuses whose genius comes to them by birth. I have a class full of normal teenagers, given the opportunity to be challenged. And they've got enough motivation, however small, to read a challenging book and be willing to say what they think about it in front of other people. Or ask what they don't know. I don't understand this part. And these students are in an environment here where every teacher, which is every full-time person here, works so hard to inculcate the value of doing meaningful work, meaningful hard work, as Mr. Yee just spoke on. I'll add that it is in the humanities where we have the opportunity to dedicate serious time to perennial questions in life, seeking to discover true answers. And if we're looking at the right books, we're engaging the wisdom of the most long-lasting thinkers the world has produced. So it stands to reason that if we're challenged well in the humanities, when we're young, we'll have built up the intellectual strength to engage any new idea, however flashy or threatening. And we can reason and discern if the new idea is true or false. What's probably going to happen is that we don't encounter new ideas, but old ideas. Recycled without citation, plagiarized and recalibrated onto a new time. But probably not new. Not like really new. More importantly, in accepting the challenge of working through an integrated humanities curriculum, we'll have been offered the choice to pursue virtue. With models of success and failure right in front of us, complete with their own reasons for action, and the characters of the stories. So that we'll encounter a choice, so that when we do encounter a choice between what serves the appetites of the flesh or what is morally good or obligated, our habits have been formed through the discipline of reading, and we have been transformed through discussion. And our choice is informed. I think the specific challenges of our program, or a program like ours, break down to the following. Reading difficult or unfamiliar books. And reading a lot of them, you might say. That's a challenge. That is a challenge. Being asked to contribute in a discussion is a challenge. Because you're offering what you have to say, your own thoughts. And somebody might totally disagree with you or say, that's wildly false. That's hard. That's a challenge. Communicating your own thoughts through writing. Writing is constantly going to be a challenge. That's our program right there. There's a fourth challenge. And that's overcoming a fear of ideas. Now, the first three of these are just what our program is. We read, and then we respond to that reading with discussion and writing. It's a very simple containment of what our program is. Read books, discuss and write about them. You respond on written page and vocally with one another. As we work through the books in discussion and our writing, we learn how to think clearly and to communicate our ideas clearly. These are largely practical challenges. And there is a bit of a learning curve. In the same way that there's a learning curve when you get into any discipline. When you start working out, you find out how weak and undisciplined your body is. After a short time, the doing of working out becomes a habit. It's the same thing with reading, discussing, and writing. To do it well requires practice and breaking undisciplined behavior. The last challenge is the challenge I want to close on, and this is the challenge of overcoming a fear of ideas. With reading and discussing great books, difficult ideas will come up. Ideas with which we disagree, ideas that, if true, would undermine how much of what we hold to be true. And I'm not sure if you've noticed, but right now in our culture, we're not very good at disagreeing. I won't say anything more on that. Everyone knows. Or considering the arguments of others to be possibly true. It's just, we're not good at those. I think that as Christians, we have the best reason not to be afraid of disagreement or dangerous ideas. When we don't understand the ideas people have thought and spoken, we're more prone to accept lies, emotional appeals, fallacies, half-truths, and defend something not worthy of our natures. This is true of Christians and non-Christians alike. But Christians believe that God is the Father of truth and that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus is referred to in John 1 as the Logos, the Word, the active, rational principle of the universe. And Jesus says the greatest commandment is to love your God with all your mind, heart, and soul. And mind is the first one that comes up. The Apostle Paul in Acts 17 dialogues with pagan Athenians and presents Christianity in words the Athenians themselves will understand. He quotes their poets and their philosophers. And he himself spent years studying Christianity before preaching it. The prophet Daniel and his friends were set in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, that they were 10 times better than all of his sorcerers and magicians. So we have these examples in the scriptures of these people who were not afraid of ideas and were able to engage them rationally for the benefit of the Israelites or the Christians and the people and the discussants. The Apostle Peter says to Christians to always be prepared to give a defense of the gospel. And a defense means a rational explanation. Truth always wins against false ideas. Always. Though you may not know how an idea may be false, yet if it is false, you can find it. Or at least you can start to find where it is false. And Great Books Education is actually a wonderful place to work through difficult ideas without fear. To encounter a challenging idea and take the time to devote your attention to thinking through it. To work through an idea over the course of 4 or 5 or 7 years. Noting how the idea is responded to over the centuries in an environment that reinforces the pursuit of truth constantly. It actually requires close and honest discussion. To do this removes the urgency and threat of a scary idea. Instead, we take our time and examine it. And it strikes me that intensive practice of these things over 7 years of your life fights against over-specialization. Specialize in college or graduate school or trade school. In junior high and high school, work through these books. It also strikes me that intensive practice of these things will never create the doctor who cannot talk about politics without pithy memes, or love without monosyllables. Thank you.